So tonight's class is lesson number 4 in Journey of the Soul, and we are moving on to a very interesting aspect of Journey of the Soul, the life and afterlife, the afterlife part. Until now, we've discussed the life part and the transition part. Tonight, we will focus on the afterlife and more specifically, heaven and hell in the Jewish perspective. Before we begin, I'd like to thank once again, the Rubin family and the Kalmanson family for sponsoring this course. May you be blessed with all spiritual and materialistic blessings. It is thanks to partners like you that we are able to offer such a course. As an introduction for tonight's class, I'd like to share a video, a short clip that will give us a good understanding on the general concepts that we've been discussing really up until now, and more specifically, the concept that we will discuss tonight and in the coming weeks.
Birth and death are as contradictory as night and light. But they are strangely associated with an identical Hebrew word, kever. Kever means a tomb where a body is buried. But kever also means a womb where life is formed. A womb is a gateway to life, while a tomb is a gateway to afterlife. But is there an afterlife? Or does laying a body to rest in a grave mark the absolute end? If it were within our power to interview a soul, we would undoubtedly glean insight into afterlife. Instead, we have chosen to eavesdrop on a set of twins in their mother's womb to shed some light on the before life.
Hey, twin, I'm scared of birth.
Why?
It's the end of existence. We get ejected. We're finished.
I'm also anxious, twin, but I'm not scared. Birth is supposed to be a transition to the real life.
Huh. Don't give me the hiccups with your after-birth real-life fantasies. How can life be supported without an umbilical cord and amniotic fluid?
Well, maybe it's a radically different form of life. Maybe we won't need the cord.
I wish you were right. I keep kicking that thing away from my neck.
Stop spinning for a minute and imagine, twin. After birth, we will enter a ginormous universe filled with light and with air that we will breathe through our mouths.
Come on, grow some brain cells, will you? Mouths are not for breathing. Besides, if your postnatal paradise existed, why has no one ever returned from that realm? Forget it. Once we leave here, we collapse into cold, dry nothingness and wither into eternal gloom.
I don't think Mother would allow that to happen. She nurtures us in this cozy womb. She sends us nutrients for months on end. For what purpose? Just to end it all with birth? No. Mother has greater plans for us than that.
Now you're beginning to sound infantile. Do you see a mother lurking in some corner of the womb? Not a trace. Show me a mother. And as for your nutrients, can't you feel that annoying cord? Don't exchange empirical for fantastical.
Thankfully, these two delightful infants made it safely to the other side. They grew up in the universe that one had described and the other had denied. And until today, they continue their clamorous debate. It is only that the topic of contention has slightly shifted from, is there life after the womb, to, is there life after the tomb?
So the idea of this parable, really, the central message is that there's something beyond our present state of existence, beyond earthly life in this world. And the fact is we can barely comprehend it, envision it. We can barely comprehend this higher form of experience. And this idea of why we can barely comprehend it is understood, because after all, we live in this physical world and we experience it, we're entrenched in it. It seems so real to us, and it is so real to us. And so we cannot fathom a reality which is beyond our present reality. An example would be, take the sci-fi from the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. They all came up with fantastical ideas of flying cars and planes that did all sorts of things, and the people that were transformed. But you know what? There was one thing that no one ever dreamed of, and that was the internet. The internet was this new creation that really transformed every single aspect of our reality. Right now, something that we are doing right now, there are some aspects of it that were envisioned, but the general concept was far beyond any science fiction could have imagined. And why is that? Because when it comes to science fiction, the ideas that we imagine are all based on our current reality, just a little bit better, a little bit wilder, but nothing which is beyond our comprehension, nothing which is beyond our current state of living. The same as when it comes to these spiritual concepts. The afterlife is something which is so far beyond our living. It's so hard for us to understand this concept. And so the ideas that we do understand is the little bit that we are able to comprehend based on parables, metaphors, and similar situations to, in a much smaller extent, that we do experience here in this world. With that introduction, we'll move on to tonight. And that is, the idea is that we're really born twice, once from the womb and once from the tomb. Why do we say we're born twice? As we explained in lesson 1, the idea is when we're born from the womb, we're entering a new reality. And once we move on to the next life, it's an afterlife. It's a new reality. And that's what we will discuss tonight. What is that new reality? Most of us have many questions on that idea. Some of us may have even joined this class precisely for that idea. What's the Jewish view on hell and heaven, the afterlife? Is it for everyone? And we'll discuss some of the psychological benefits of it as well. And so first we'll begin with what we think we know about the Jewish view of hell and heaven, the afterlife, and what we'd like to know about it. So if you can drop in the comments some of those ideas that you think you know about, that you do know about the Jewish view of heaven and hell, and what you'd like to know more about, and we'll circle back to that towards the end of the class. If you'd like to unmute yourself for a moment, we can have 2 or 3 people unmute themselves, and this way we can get a better picture of what everyone's idea is. Who's going to be the volunteer, either to post in the chat box or to unmute?
Well, don't you think that mostly we think of it as heaven is wonderful, everything is beautiful, and hell is where you pay for all the things that you did wrong while you were here?
Perfect. So that's one idea. Heaven is kind of the reward, and hell is the punishment. Eternal damnation, if you will, or punishment for all the sins that we've done. All right. Any other ideas on what we feel Judaism's perspective on heaven and hell is?
I heard kind of a vague idea. I never heard a really clear explanation, but that, heaven for the good person is to keep getting closer and closer to God. I guess asymptotically approaching God. And hell is alienation from God. So like being like a place of hell or a place of heaven, it's more like a proximity to God. That's what I've heard.
Okay, so heaven and hell are a measure of proximity to holiness, to godliness. Okay, Betsy, you had something you'd like to share?
No, I changed my mind.
No. All right, so those are some ideas, and the question really is a question that maybe we may be afraid to ask is if there is a hell, am I headed there? Is that something I should be afraid of? Is that something I should keep at the forefront of my mind? It brings to mind a story they tell of a man from Illinois, a couple from Illinois, and they're headed down south to Florida for vacation. The wife has some business left to take care of in Chicago, and so she stays back an extra day. And the husband goes ahead and he lands in Florida. He checks into his hotel. And late at night, just before he goes to sleep in anticipation of his wife joining him the next day, he decides to send her a short email about him checking into the hotel in Miami. There's just one problem. In the email address, he confused a single letter. And instead of reaching his wife, the email reached a recent widow. And the widow opens her inbox, she reads the email, and she falls in a dead faint. Her family comes quickly, they hear a thud, they come quickly, they wake her up, and she points to the email, and the email reads as follows. Dearest wife, just got checked in. Everything prepared for your arrival tomorrow. P.S. It sure is hot down here. So when it comes to hell, that's always a question that some of us may be thinking about in the back of our mind. Is that where I'm going to end up? And so before we get into that discussion, if you look on page 130, exercise 3.3, you'll notice there's a checkbox. And if you have a pen, good. If not, it's also good. Let's look at these 8 different examples and rate the following examples according to the degree of pleasure that they would provide you.
What page did you say?
Page 130. These are general ideas of various pleasures that we can enjoy throughout our life, and different ideas that we aspire to in our levels of enjoyment and pleasure. We're going to circle back to this idea throughout the class. We will refer to it a number of times. And with that, we'll move on to the concept of reward and punishment in Judaism. You see, the idea that God takes interest in every human being's actions and metes out punishments and rewards based on our actions is actually a foundation of Judaism. We're going to read on page 132. A quote from Maimonides' 13 Principles of Faith. There are 13 principles of faith on which is the foundation of the entire Judaism, of the entire Torah. The 11th of the 13 principles of Jewish faith is that God, blessed be He, rewards those who observe the commandments of the Torah and punishes those who transgress its prohibitions. Is Maimonides talking about physical punishments and rewards, or is he talking about something spiritual? And the answer is he's talking about both, but primarily on the spiritual punishments and rewards, namely the punishments and rewards that come following the departing of the soul from the body. As he continues in that exact statement, text 1b, the greatest reward is the pleasures of the world to come. The strongest punishment is to be cut off from the world to come. Various levels of reward. There's rewards, spiritual rewards. There's rewards that are physical materialistic rewards. We can name a few. health, happiness, wealth, more materialistic. And there are various forms that are referenced throughout the Torah of these materialistic rewards. And then there are spiritual rewards. Which rewards are more important to us? If we reference back to that and to what we just, that exercise that we did on page 130, look at the rewards that we circled more. There's happiness, there's love, there's wisdom. Those are the more spiritual pleasures in life. And I guess that many of us, if not most of us, circled higher numbers by those versus the materialistic pleasures in life. The cruise, the country club, social status, those are more materialistic. And we probably circled more or higher numbers from these spiritual pleasures because it has much more meaning to us. It's much more enjoyable. It has much more depth. How much more so when we're talking about real spiritual reward after the soul leaves the body, those rewards are infinitely greater than any reward, any pleasure we may enjoy in this world. And so that leads us to a deep Kabbalistic concept, which the sages discuss at great length, the idea of punishment and reward in Torah. What does the punishment and reward in Torah exactly mean? See, generally speaking, when we look at punishment and reward, why is punishment necessary? Why are rewards necessary? Is it something that God really cares about these little details in life, and so he's going to punish us if we make a mistake? Or he'll reward us if we do something good, almost like a teacher with a child or a parent with a child. And as a matter of fact, nowadays, punishment and reward is somewhat archaic. We've moved on from that. We moved on from punishments, right? We have consolation prizes. We don't punish. We just explain to the child and what they did wrong and try to encourage them to do better. And that's true. There's a lot of truth to that. And that's very important when educating a child. And so what is the concept of punishment in Judaism? Is God really trying to catch us on the small stuff? It sounds really belittling to God and to us. Why must be threatened? If you don't do this, you'll end up in hell. If you do this, you'll go to heaven. Do we really need punishment and reward? And so on a very simple level, the idea is not for God, but for us. To be honest with ourselves and to analyze our lives. If we have fear of something, we end up not doing it. When we go driving, that's why any city has tickets in place, fines, driving fines, traffic fines, parking fines. What's the idea of fines? We're not little kids. We don't have to be feared, pushed into, scared, threatened into doing something which is good. But nonetheless, we like to try to cut corners. We like to sometimes we're not so careful. And so we need these kind of warning signs. We need these kind of incentives and warnings to encourage us to do good and to help us avoid doing wrongdoing. And so that's what God's doing. He knows that we are somewhat petty. We are somewhat, we need that encouragement and that warning. And so God has placed punishment and reward as goalposts for us. But really, there's a deeper understanding of the dynamics of reward and punishment according to Judaism. And that will be on page 134, text 2. The great Italian Kabbalist, known by his last name, the Ricanti, Rabbi Menachem ben Binyamin Ricanti, writes as follows. Betsy, would you like to read for us text 2? On page 134.
Do not consider the punishments described in the Torah as comparable to penalties a person incurs for disobeying the decree of a mortal king. Not at all. Rather, they are completely natural consequences. The one who fails to observe a Torah commandment is denied the good that naturally results from its observance. It is comparable to one who fails to sow his field and therefore cannot reap a harvest, or one who fails to wear clothes is then cold. It is the natural consequence as the warmth provided by fire, the wetness of water, and the satiation of bread. In the same way, it is the nature of each mitzvah to provide the positive consequences that are promised for its observance or negative consequences that are stated regarding its transgression. Sorry.
So what do we have from this statement from the Rikanti, the 13th century sage? What he's explaining is as follows. There's a big difference between the idea of reward versus the idea of consequence. And he uses a very simple example, a simple metaphor. Reward is when someone goes to work, they work hard, we get paid, and with that money, we buy food. Why is that a reward? Because the natural consequence of work isn't money. Some people work and they don't get paid anything. And even if someone gets paid, they can blow that money on gambling. They can use that money for investment on real estate. It doesn't necessarily translate into food. So even someone who works, that does not equal food. Someone who works doesn't equal money. Money doesn't equal food. It isn't the natural consequence of things. That's the concept of reward. What the Rikanti explains is that this is the concept of consequence. When someone sows their field, then they reap, they now have food. It's a natural progression of things. In the negative side of things, if someone puts their hand in the fire, their hand gets burnt. That's not a punishment, that's a consequence. And so when it comes to, the Rikanti explains that when it comes to the fulfillment of Torah and mitzvahs, when it comes to the reward and punishment that we receive from the fulfillment of the mitzvahs or from the lack thereof or transgressing the prohibitions, it's not a reward or punishment in the traditional sense. It's a consequence. It's a natural outcome. It's something of our making. For example, when the doctor tells us if we eat healthy, we're going to be healthy. Eat more vegetables, eat a certain amount of protein every day, stay away from sweets, you'll be healthier. Is that a reward that the doctor's rewarding us for eating healthy? Or is that the natural consequence? You eat healthy, you're going to be healthier. You don't eat healthy, chances are you're not going to be as healthy. It's not a punishment, it's a natural consequence. This idea holds for all forms of reward when it comes to Torah. The materialistic rewards, the spiritual rewards, the materialistic punishments, and the spiritual punishments are all natural outcomes of our doing. They aren't reward and punishment in the way we understand it. Which brings to mind another joke, another story, where this individual shows up at a doctor's office and the secretary asks him, so, sir, what do you have? He says, I have shingles. So the doctor, the secretary says, all right, have a seat. Here's the clipboard, fill out all your information. He goes, he sits down, he fills out the information, date of birth, insurance information. He fills it all out, hands it back. A number of minutes later, the nurse comes in, calls him into the room, go on the scale, he gets weighed, he gets checked out. The doctor comes, doctor checks him out, and he says, sir, you don't have shingles. He said, no. I'm here for a delivery of shingles for your roof. Where would you like me to place them? The same word can have different meanings. When it comes to punishment and reward, according to Torah, punishment and reward is not the way we perceive it, as punishment is an arbitrary idea that's somehow strung together. It's a natural consequence that flows. When we do something good, if you put gas in your car will drive. You put water in the car won't drive. Is that a punishment for putting water in the car? Absolutely not. It's a natural outcome. And that is the idea when it comes to reward and consequences. The reward and punishment from the Torah, it's not a punishment, it's a natural consequence. As it says in the Ethics of Our Fathers in text 3, page 135, the reward of a mitzvah is a mitzvah. The retribution for a sin is a sin. Now, on face value, what's it saying? On face value, the idea is that the reward of a mitzvah is God will enable us and give us an immediate chance to perform another mitzvah, because God is rewarding an individual with another mitzvah opportunity, and this way the reward will multiply exponentially, and the same vice versa. But the Hasidic masters explain something deeper. And that is the reward of a mitzvah is that mitzvah itself and its natural consequences. When we do a mitzvah, there are the natural consequences that come from it. Take, for example, someone who commits a transgression of robbery. They steal something. There's the consequences that will come, the punishment that will come for stealing something by going to court and having to pay a fine or whatever it is. But then there's the natural consequence that come. This individual has robbed themselves of their own dignity. That's not a punishment that someone has given him. That's a natural consequence that has come from the sin itself. The same when it comes to a mitzvah. When we perform a good deed and now we feel good about it, take, for example, Shabbos, that we rest on the seventh day. Instead of working hard and doing all types of mundane things for 7 days straight, we're going to feel wiped out. It's not a punishment that we feel wiped out. It's a natural consequence. But if we rest on the seventh day, now that we feel rested, we feel refreshed, we feel invigorated, that itself is the reward for the mitzvah, the natural outcome. And this idea applies to the afterlife as well. As we see in text 4, Ruchama, would you like to read text 4 on page 136? You have to unmute first.
Okay. The fires of Gehenna, hell, are stoked in direct proportion to the degree to which the wicked fan their fiery passions. Accordingly, we must say that Gan Eden, paradise, is amplified by the tremendous passion that the righteous invest in their Torah study and in the performance of God's commandments. They take great pleasure and delight in God himself, and their deeds generate a corresponding abundance of light in Gan Eden.
And so this gives us a radically different perspective on the afterlife. The afterlife is not an existing world where we enter after death and there's this punishment, this room of punishment and this room of gifts. Rather, the afterlife isn't reward or punishment in the conventional sense. It's the full and unobstructed experience of our actions in this world. It's entirely based on our actions. If our actions were all positive, then our heaven will be one of tremendous light, of tremendous blessing, of tremendous goodness. And if our life was peppered throughout with various misdeeds, various sins, then as we shall soon see what exactly that aspect of hell, or as we'll refer to more specifically, the Jewish term Gehinnom, is as a direct consequence of our actions. And this moves on. Before I see someone post a question, just a moment before we move on. So assuming there is a positive consequence, then in addition, there is an unexpected reward. If I understand correctly, that there's a consequence plus an unexpected reward. Is that, I'm assuming that that's the question, correct me if I'm wrong. And the idea is yes and no. Yes, because the unexpected reward is what the natural consequence is. We don't necessarily understand what the natural consequence of our spiritual deeds are. What is that spiritual natural consequence? We may not understand. It may be beyond our faculties. And so it's somewhat unexpected. But no, because it isn't unexpected, it's a natural consequence. Take, for example, the metaphor I mentioned about a child touching fire. The child doesn't know that the consequence of touching fire is burning their hands. And that comes to them as a tremendous, unexpected consequence. But as an adult, we know that is the consequence of touching fire. And so the same is regarding the spiritual consequences of the afterlife. Which brings us to understanding what exactly is hell according to Torah. Say another story. They say another story where this group of Jewish women from the synagogue sisterhood, they had a terrible accident and there weren't any survivors. That's definitely not a joke, but there weren't any survivors. The entire sisterhood comes up to heaven and it's a lot of people to process. And so they say, keep them in hell for a few days while we go through their cases. They'll have their turn before the heavenly court, and then they'll go each one to where they belong. They're supposed to be there for 3 days, but after 1 day, the secretary at the front desk gets a call from hell and says, listen, you got to take these women out of here very quickly. The secretary says, why? What's going on? She says, it's only been a day here and the sisterhood has already started to raise funds for air conditioning. When it comes to hell, what exactly is a Jewish view of hell? Once we understand the idea of punishment, that it's not punishment per se, rather it's a natural consequence, that enables us to understand that according to Torah, hell is a soul catharsis. And why do we say that? Hell isn't something that we may have perceived up until now, that it's eternal damnation. You know, they brought it upon themselves. They deserved it. It's something that's becoming because this is what they've done all their lives and so on and so forth. That may be the human reaction to someone who has had negative behavior throughout their entire life. And it leaves us uninspired, it leaves us squirming, it leaves us maybe even fearful. So what is Gehinnom, which is the term used for hell in the Torah and throughout Jewish literature? Gehinnom is the place where souls are rehabilitated. The eventual destination of all souls, as we shall soon see, is heaven, Gan Eden. In order to reach that place, we need a rehab stint. Our divine soul needs a rehab stint. Why would our divine soul need a rehab stint? If it's a veritable piece of God, as we've quoted in the past from the Tanya and the great works of the Kabbalists, if it's an actual piece of God, why would our soul need a rehab stint before it enters heaven, before it enters Gan Eden? That's because, take for example, someone who gives charity. When an individual gives charity, there's that initial deed of giving that charity. They gave it to a poor person. Who receives benefit from that? The poor individual. They receive benefit, wonderful benefit. They now have food, money to buy food. They have money in their bank account that they can use to pay rent or whatnot. But there's a greater benefit, a deeper benefit, and that's the benefit of the giver. The giver now feels good about themselves, that they help someone else. Once that individual becomes a giver, not someone who gave on a one-off, but they become a giver, their entire being changes. They become a more elevated, a transformed person, a better person, taking every aspect of them along for the ride. The same as when it comes to transgressions. When we commit a transgression, we're not taking just the evil side of our soul, or not of a soul, the evil soul, the animalistic soul. We're not taking just our body. We're even taking our godly soul along for the ride. And it gets concealed. It gets affected. It gets tarnished somewhat. The outer aspect, the core of the soul cannot be touched. But the outer layers of the soul get tarnished by every misdeed that we do throughout this life. And so, for the majority of us, before we go to our final destination, which is heaven, everyone ends up there, we need to go through a purifying step, an intermediate step. The soul rehab, a halfway house, place to go and take a shower, clean off from the dirt that we've accumulated throughout our lives here, until before we can move on to heaven. And the Talmud relates a fascinating story that it gives us, that's very instructive in the role that Gehinnom plays in Jewish thought. And this is a story about a very enigmatic sage who was known by his name Acher. Acher literally means someone else. That's what Acher means. Why was he given such a name, someone else? He was given such a name because he was a great sage who had studied a tremendous wealth of Torah. He lived in the 2nd century of the Common Era. He was a contemporary of Rabbi Akiva. His name was Elisha ben Avuya, great sage. And then the unthinkable happened. He became a heretic. Not just any heretic, he became a moral degenerate, a traitor, actively aiding and abetting the murderous Roman regime who destroyed the temple and killed many, many Jews. Someone who went from the greatest of heights to the lowest of deaths. And the Talmud discusses his death and the events that followed. Doris, would you like to read text 5 on page 138, the continuation of the story from the Talmud?
Elisha ben Abiyah was a former Mishnaic sage who turned to such public heresy and treachery that he was derogatively nicknamed Asher, something else. When Asher died, the heavenly court declared, "We will not afflict him with judgment in Gehenna, nor will we permit him to enter paradise." Their reasoning? We will not afflict him with judgment because he studied much Torah, but we will not permit him to enter paradise because he sinned egregiously. Asher's former disciple, Rabbi Meir, said, "Better that he indeed be judged and punished so that he may then enter paradise."
So here's Rabbi Meir. Here's his teacher who taught him most of his Torah, who's now referred to as Acher. Acher means it's a derogatory term. Someone else, we're not even going to mention his name. He who may not be named, as we may know from some current pop culture. We can't even name him, but it's his great teacher. It's someone who he felt a deep connection to the last moments in life, as is related throughout the pages of the Talmud. And with such devotion to his teacher, with such love for his teacher, what does he say at the end? Rabbi Meir is praying, basically, he wants Acher to go to hell. What type of student is that? Really, is that what he wants for his great teacher? Is that what he wants for his great teacher, to be able to go to Gehinnom? But now that we understand what hell is, it isn't eternal damnation. It's rather a soul rehabilitation. It's the best thing a student can want from their teacher who has gone through so much. Yes, the heavenly court said that he can't enter hell because he has so much Torah study. But he can't enter heaven because he has so many sins. In other words, he's in limbo. It's the worst thing for a soul. Because being in limbo means that he won't reach its final destination of heaven. And so Rabbi Meir prayed that his teacher should be able to enter hell. In other words, be able to go through rehabilitation. It's going to be a tough rehabilitation. As a matter of fact, the Talmud later relates a very, very rare case, but that Acher went through 150 years of soul rehabilitation.
Wow.
Following which he entered heaven. Probably one of the longest rehab stints that's related, because generally speaking, as we will see soon, it's a much shorter time that most people spend in Gehinnom. But nonetheless, Rabbi Meir prayed for him to go there, because it's not the ultimate punishment. Remaining in limbo is the ultimate punishment. Gehinnom is not a punishment, it's a cleansing process that enables the soul to experience paradise. It's a blessing. It's not a destination, it's a transitional phase on the road to the ultimate destination. As the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad Hasidus, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, explains in text 6, quote from the Torah Or, page 139. The purpose of Gehinnom is to refine the soul and rid it of any sickness, spiritual sickness that is, that it contracted. This is similar to the process of smelting silver, wherein the dross and sediment is burned away in a furnace, leaving the silver clean and free of impurities. Similarly, for the soul to be able to experience the light of the supernal pleasures and bask in God's radiance, it must first be refined in the spiritual fire of Gehinnom, whereby the negative is purged from the positive. We're refining our soul. It's a transitional period to refine our soul. So now, what's a more appropriate name for Gehenna? Not hell, because that immediately enables us to conjure up these images of fire, of burning pits, of eternal damnation. Much better translation of Gehinnom would be soul catharsis. It's a cleansing, it's a purge. And that's a much more accurate description of the Jewish thoughts, the Jewish explanation of what Gehenna is. We get to some questions. Here we go. Do non-Jewish souls go to Gehenna? If not, where do non-Jewish souls go? 100%. Based on my understanding of various Jewish texts, non-Jewish souls have heaven, and as a result, non-Jewish souls also have to go through this purifying procedure in order to reach there. When a soul is born, is it pure? 100%. The soul is pure. And so if, God forbid, a child passes at a very, very young age, say after just a few days, or even a stillborn, for example, God forbid, it goes straight to heaven. There is no hell for that individual. There's no soul catharsis because there's no any tarnish that has happened to the individual. I was waiting for this question. This is the following question. What about Hitler and Eichmann? Do they go to Gehenna? How about the worst of offenders throughout our history? Do they also go through Gehenna and then just as a soul rehabilitation, moving on to heaven? It's a tough question. It's a good question. And we will get to it later on in the class. So thank you for bringing that up. What exactly is the nature of this painful experience? What exactly is the nature of Gehenna, of the soul catharsis? What happens in hell? We're running out of time, but it brings to mind another story, so we have to share it, because stories and jokes are always good. Say this politician, after 120, comes to heaven, and the heavenly court tells him, look, you were a great politician. You did wonderful throughout your stint as a public servant. And so it's free, up to you, free choice to choose where you'd like to go, heaven or purgatory. So the politician thinks to himself and he says, hey, can I get a tour? Want to see both? He says, no problem. We'll give you a tour. They take him to hell, and it's beautiful. It's a 6-star resort. There's a beautiful beach, and there's 5-course meals, and it's gourmet meals. It's wonderful. It's you have everything anyone has ever dreamt of. You can go skydiving, and you can go deep sea diving, and you can play in the local casinos with unlimited money. It's wonderful. It's paradise. He turns to the tour guide. He says, all right, let's go see heaven. If this is hell, let's go see heaven. Takes him to heaven, and it's Motel 6. It's got clean towels. It's got clean linen for the most part. It's got a pool that it looks like it was cleaned a few days ago, and there's some tuna sandwiches and egg salad sandwiches in the fridge. They are a few days old. On Shabbos, they even serve kugel, and there's a few men with white beards that study Torah, and that's heaven. Turns to the angel giving the Torah, and he says, all right, would anyone know if I choose hell? Would that be a scandal? He says, no, no one would know. This is free for you to choose. He says, all right, I choose to go to purgatory. He says, no problem. First thing in the morning, that's where we'll send you. It's perfect. The next morning, they take him and they flick him into purgatory, and he lands on a burning, fiery pit, and there's exactly what he imagined purgatory to be. Pitchforks and these angels throwing him from one bonfire to the next. It's real hell. He calls for the angel. Who gave him the Torah, and he says, what's going on? Yesterday I was here. It was beautiful. It was paradise. It was a 5-star resort. The angel says, yesterday we were campaigning. So when it comes to hell, what exactly is the Torah's view of hell? Now that we understand that it's not hell, Gehenna is not hell. Gehenna is a soul catharsis. It's a rehab stint. It's a transitional period before we head into heaven. What exactly is this soul catharsis? And so we'll read on text 7, page 139. Phyllis, would you like to read for us? Page 139, text 7.
Sure. The purpose of hell is to refine the soul and rid it of any sickness that it contracted.
Now the next, text 7 on page 139.
I am on 139. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, then an individual will also see himself in a new light. Even in our mortal physical state, looking at oneself can sometimes be pleasing and at other times very painful. Imagine standing naked before God with your memory wide open, completely transparent, without any jamming mechanism or reducing valve to diminish its force. You will remember everything you ever did. You will see it in the light of the unshaded spirit, or if you will, in God's own light that shines from one end of the creation to the other. The memory of every good deed and mitzvah will be the sublimest of pleasures, but your memory will also be open to all the things of which you are ashamed. They cannot be rationalized away or dismissed. You will be facing yourself, fully aware of the consequences of all your deeds. We all know the terrible shame and humiliation experienced when one is caught in the act of doing something wrong. Imagine being caught by one's own memory with no place to escape. A number of our great teachers, and you know the names, write that the fire of Gehenna is actually the burning shame one experiences because of one's sins. Of course, these concepts, as used by our sages, may also contain deeper mysteries and meanings, but a major ingredient of this fire may be shame. How else could one characterize the agony of unconcealed shame upon a soul? We are taught that the judgment of the wicked lasts 12 months. The pain eventually subsides.
Thank you. So we'll get to that last statement in a moment, but what are we expressing over here? A perfect metaphor for this example are human relationships, and that serves as a useful analogy for this idea. So you have someone who's a self-centered, someone who for years, for whatever reason, can't foster any wonderful relationships with people. And oftentimes it's because of that self-centered behavior and thought processes. What does such an individual have to do? They have to go through this process of an honest look in the mirror. Think about their past. Think about everything they've done, how they view the world, how they view others, how they view their relationships with other people. And having that deep look at themselves, confronting their past, isn't necessarily something comforting. It hurts, it's painful, but it's beneficial. It's the only way to have this healing, this cathartic process, to allow a person to move on to the next level. And the same is with the soul. The soul catharsis is the soul experiencing its negative actions in the fullest intensity possible. The soul sees the truth in Gehenna. The soul sees where it should really be, what it should have really been doing throughout its life on earth. And it sees how the ego got in the way and prevented it from experiencing the truth throughout its life on earth. It's a very painful process for the soul to go through that shame of everything it had done here on earth. But it's the most cleansing process for the damaged soul. The truth, it never truly hurts someone, but it really hurts in a healing way. It goes through all those ideas that were false ideas. It goes through all the ideas that it collected and the pain it suffered. Once it gathers all of that, the soul gets rid of all its baggage and it's free to move on and experience paradise. How long is that process? How long for the average soul does it have to go through that rehab period, that painful rehab period? In text 8 from the Mishnah, it's not eternal damnation. The average soul, the maximum sentence of the wicked in Gehinnom is 12 months, says the Mishnah. That's it, 12 months. Now, as we mentioned earlier with Acher, he was in hell for 150 years. Others throughout the Talmud, as mentioned, rare occasions, that were there for 1,000 years, or some that are there forever. But those are very, very far and few in between. For the majority of souls, even people that we perceived as extremely wicked, not the ultimate wicked, but people that we think are the terrible people in our society, it's 12 months is the average time. And at the conclusion of this time, the majority of souls, even the most sinful of souls, go straight to heaven, because Gehenna is a phase, not a destination. As the Mishnah says elsewhere, text 9, page 141, each member of the Jewish people has a portion in the world to come. As it is stated in Isaiah, your people are all righteous. They shall inherit the land forever. They are the branch of my planting, the work of my hands in which I take pride. This Mishnah is referring specifically to the level of heaven that's for the Jewish people, which is why it singles out each member of the Jewish people. The sages in the Talmud explain that there is a heaven for the non-Jews as well. But that's not what it's referring to in this verse in Isaiah. Hence the singling out the Jewish people. And so God says that every single Jewish person is righteous and will inherit the land. Why are we righteous? Because after that 12-month period, after the soul catharsis, after that purging and cleansing phase, that soul is now perfect as any other soul. And so it's ready straight to move into heaven. But there's something else that can help the soul. It doesn't have to wait until this soul catharsis, this cleansing period that happens after the soul's passing, which can last a maximum of 12 months for the majority of souls. We're not talking about the select few that go for longer. What is that? Two other options. One is teshuvah, repentance on this world. As our sages tell us of a great Jew whose name was Elazar ben Durdaya. Elazar ben Durdaya was a Jew who had committed every single sin possible, imaginable. And it came to a point where there was a heavenly voice that called out that every single person will merit heaven. Every single person, his tshuva is accepted, except for Elazar ben Durdaya. When he heard that, he sat down and he started weeping bitterly. And he cried so much and so deeply and so truthfully from his essence that his soul passed while he was weeping. Following that, the Talmud tells us, a heavenly voice called out that there are people who can acquire their heaven in a short period of time, and that is Elazar ben Durdaya. Because through teshuvah, that is the soul catharsis. Here in this world, we can have that soul catharsis. Another way of having that soul cleansing is someone who suffers in this world. Someone who suffers terribly throughout this world, that is their soul cleansing. That is their suffering. God, for whatever reason, had decided that that individual should have their soul cleansing and catharsis throughout their lives here in this world. That cleanses them and enables them to skip that cleansing phase and move on to heaven. What is heaven? Stop for a moment to see if there's any questions. One question, which I believe we addressed, and the second question, what about a psychopath with callous disregard, no shame, no conscience, no empathy? I'm going to guess that that's a reference to the shame that we spoke about, the soul, when it has that shame in purgatory, in the period of Gehinnom. At that point, every soul isn't a psychopath. At that point, every soul sees the truth, is in its purest form, not in its form the way it was here on this world. And so it perceives everything the way it is the truth, and it has that spiritual shame. So now that we've gone through this transitional period, now that we've gone through the souls who go through this soul catharsis, and they move on to heaven, what is heaven? What is our soul experience there? What is paradise? Is it that 5-star resort? Is it a Motel 6? Is it a place of perfect harmony? Of what? What is it? So we'll begin with text 10. A quote from the famous Spanish sage, Portuguese sage, Rabbi Don Yitzchak Abarbanel, 15th century sage. Rachel, would you like to read for us text 10 on page 143?
Sure, thank you. Spiritual reward is abstruse and difficult for mortal intellect to visualize and grasp as long as the intellect remains attached to a corporeal body. Just as one who's blind cannot grasp the concept of colors, so the spirit that is engaged with corporeality cannot grasp purely spiritual matters.
Thank you. Somewhat like the metaphor that we gave in the beginning of the class about the twins. It's a reality which is beyond us. It is something which is so far-fetched from our imagination and from our current living experience that it's really something which is beyond our comprehension. Take, for example, a blind person who has never seen any colors and try to explain the concept of colors to them and the reality of colors. Regardless of that individual's level of intelligence or the clarity of the explanation, they won't be able to truly understand what colors are, because in their world, colors simply don't exist. They may have a certain vague understanding of them by way of analogy, by way of metaphor, examples, but they won't be able to understand it perfectly. And the same is with this purely spiritual experience and pleasure of paradise. It cannot be properly grasped by our finite minds who have only experienced physical existence and pleasures. So we're going to give some parables and various explanations for the little bit that we can possibly understand. And we'll begin with a Talmudic quote from the Talmud passage in Berachot, text 11, page 144. In the hereafter, there was no eating, drinking, procreation, commerce, jealousy, hatred, or competition. Rather, the righteous sit, their heads adorned with crowns, and they delight in the radiance of the divine presence. The ultimate level of pleasure. Now let's talk about pleasure for a minute. The beginning, we had this exercise where we went through various forms of pleasure and what would give us the most pleasure. As we go through life, our ideas of pleasure change. In infancy, as we grow older, we get pleasure from our parents shaking their rattle before us. As we get older, lollipops are something tremendous. My Rachel, who's 18 months, she loves lollipops, right? She walks around, pop, pop, pop. Whenever she sees one, she can spot one from a mile away. She has wonderful vision when it comes to lollipops because that's her pleasure. That's something that she enjoys most. As children get older and become teens and become adults, our pleasures change. One of the most exquisite pleasures we learn to enjoy is the pleasure of an intimate relationship. The delight we take in the closest of a fellow human being, whether it's a spouse, a parent, a sibling, a child, a close friend. It's something which is tremendous, something which is deep. Think about for a moment the closest you've ever felt to another human being and recall the pleasure associated with that closeness that you've experienced. Performance of mitzvahs forges a bond and an intimate relationship with the Almighty. Down here, that relationship is concealed. That deep, intimate connection and bond that we have with the Almighty is concealed. But when we reach heaven, when the soul departs the body and the physical world, it's finally able to experience the effects of his actions. This deep bond that our soul creates, this deep relationship that our soul creates with God, that is the experience of the afterlife. That is paradise. Paradise is the experience of our relationship with God. And this is the greatest possible pleasure for the soul. Just as we crave human relationships, the soul craves an unrestricted relationship with its creator, and that is essentially what paradise is. And in fact, the pleasure of closeness that we feel in human relationships is a small taste of the pleasure that the soul has in being close to God. That awesome, indescribable pleasure that we feel, that closeness that we feel in the closeness to another person, pales in comparison to what the soul's pleasure is from the closeness to its source. That is the idea of afterlife, according to Torah. And it's interesting to note of modern research into coping with following the death of a loved one. Following the passing of a loved one, various people experience and suffer from depression, PTSD, and obviously that all has to be dealt with the proper professionals. But psychology researchers for years have analyzed this idea of how do spiritual and religious beliefs affect bereavement, specifically the idea of belief in an afterlife. In 2007, there was a review of 32 scientific studies published between 1990 and 2005, which contained a tremendous amount of data. And the general idea of that data showed us that 94% of people felt positive effects, some positive effects from believing in spiritual and religious beliefs on having a positive effect on bereavement. Only 6% reported, 6 studies reported only limited positive effects, and only 1 study reported that there are negative effects. So the general from all the studies show that 94% show some positive effects. That religion, and specifically the belief in an afterlife, actually helps in the grieving process. So obviously there wasn't a perfect, significant link between religion and the ability to cope with grief. It wasn't proven, but subjects interviewed, as 94% found that beliefs were helpful in being strong, helping them with the grieving process, and being more optimistic about the future. Now that we understand what the Jewish vision of view of punishment and reward, which led us to understand what hell and heaven is according to Torah, according to the Jewish view. Now we'll move on to something which has been asked throughout the course by various people. The question is, what's our contribution to the souls that have passed? To their experience in that transitional period, their experience in heaven, is there a contribution that we can give? Before I move on to that, I will stop for some questions. Suffering, why do the innocent have to suffer here or anywhere? Why do the innocent have to suffer? That's it's an age-old question. We're not going to get into it. It's beyond the scope of tonight's class. There is generally the idea of with regard to the topic, the limited topic that we're discussing here of heaven and hell, our sages tell us that if the innocent may have done something small in order to not put the soul through that transitional period, which is terribly painful for the soul, the individual goes through some sort of suffering. Obviously, that does not answer the question. It's a deep question, it's a troubling question, and it's one that really, there is no real answer to. It's something that God, for whatever reason, in his infinite wisdom, God's infinite wisdom has decided on various steps. And so we're not going to get deeper into that question. And you say, is that experience pure love? 100%. This pure love, the soul relationship, that deep relationship with the Almighty is the purest level of love possible. Every soul goes to Gehenna for a period of time. Some need less rehab. Yes. As a matter of fact, the sixth Chabad Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, explained that the average amount of time that a soul spends in hell, various souls only have to, if someone has done more commandments and fulfilled more commandments throughout their lives, their period of time in this purgatory may only be 4 or 5 months, as opposed to someone who didn't perform any commandments throughout their life, where their soul catharsis takes a little bit longer. The tarnishing to the soul takes longer to polish, and so they spend 10, 11 months. But as a matter of fact, as we'll mention momentarily, when it comes to Kaddish, some of you may be familiar that Kaddish is only recited following the passing of a soul, of a loved one. Kaddish is recited for 11 months. The purpose of Kaddish, which we'll get to momentarily, is for, helps with that elevation, with that soul catharsis period, the transitional period of the soul throughout its period in the transitional period of Gehinnom. And so in order to, we say that after 11 months, we don't feel that this person was such a bad person that they will be there for 12 months. And so everyone stops saying Kaddish after 11 months to show that we never believe that someone was so terrible that they have to go through a full 12 months of that Gehinnom process. How does reincarnation fit in? That will be next week's class. Thank you for mentioning that. So what does this have to do with us? What can we do? Can we do anything? And what can we do? What is the purpose of saying Kaddish? What do we do on a yard site? Why do we say Yiskar and all of that? Just as no two individuals experience this world alike, everyone who goes through this world with their own personal place, their own personal experience, so too paradise is not a monolithic world, but one with myriad levels. Many, many levels. As a matter of fact, is the point of entry of the soul, and that's shaped by the actions in this world. The spiritual revelations it affected and it created, its spiritual experiences, the depth of that relationship that it created throughout its existence in this world, the point of entry for various souls, even after going through the 12 months, the period, the transitional period of Gehenna, now that the soul is holy, now that the soul is ready to enter heaven, there are various points of entries. Some souls enter a higher level of Gan Eden, of heaven, of paradise, and some souls enter a lower level of heaven. It's all dependent on our commitment and our fulfillment of good deeds, of mitzvot, throughout our life here. As a matter of fact, even after those point of entries, the soul is on a constant progression, higher and higher, experiencing a greater level of spiritual sensitivity, a greater level of spiritual and deeper level of that spiritual relationship with the Almighty. That happens regularly, on a daily basis, on a momentarily basis, every day of the year. But then comes the yard site. The yard site is kind of a quantum leap, where the soul leaps from its current position to an even greater position, to an even greater, deeper relationship with its creator. Greater than that can be accomplished throughout its regular progression throughout the year. It transitions, but it transitions on a much greater level. What are those transitions based on? If the soul's relationship with the Almighty is based on our fulfillment of commandments, physical commandments throughout our lives, putting on tefillin, keeping Shabbos, giving charity, eating kosher, studying Torah. Once the soul comes to heaven, as we explained in the first class, in the first lesson, it cannot perform any more commandments. It can't put on tefillin. It can't study Torah in the way that we study it. It can't give charity. It can't. It simply can't. It isn't a physical realm. It isn't a physical world. So where does it get this level? Where does it get this kind of energy to propel it to a higher level, to constantly be elevated, especially on its yard site, to go through that quantum leap? Only through the mitzvot. Only through the actions. but they can't do actions. And so the souls of our loved ones experience this great pleasure and this great relationship, this deep relationship with the Almighty on greater levels, reaching higher and higher and higher throughout their stay in Gan Eden, which is infinite. How did they go from one level to the next? Through the physical commandments that we perform in their honor. Through us putting on tefillin in memory of a loved one. Through us giving charity, sponsoring a Torah class in memory and honor of a loved one. They now have more spiritual fuel that will propel them to a higher level. That's the intervention mechanism to enable it to go higher. Imagine a plane that's on autopilot. The plane that's on autopilot, now it takes off and it goes to 30,000 feet and it travels for 750 miles and then it starts its descent. It can do all of that with autopilot, but it has to be pre-programmed. It has to be pre-programmed. The soul in heaven is that pre-programmed plane on autopilot. It reaches 30,000 feet, it reaches 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 based on it's pre-programmed, it's time it's spent here in heaven, on earth, fulfilling those commandments. But once it reaches heaven, it's on autopilot. What's the intervention mechanism? What's the time when a physical pilot can go ahead and stop the autopilot, take over and go higher to 35,000, 40,000 or whatever is needed? That is our intervention. That is our performance of mitzvahs in honor and in memory of our loved ones. Text 12, quote from the famous Rashba, Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderet, one of the most famous early sages from the 13th century. Let's see. If you'd like to read and I haven't called on you to read, please feel free to offer your reading skills. Ben, would you like to read for us text 12 on page 146?
I don't have the text in front of me, Rabbi. Sorry.
All right, no problem. Let's see. Roberta, would you like to read for us text 12? All right, how about Lynn? Would you like to read for us text 12 on page 146? You'll have to unmute yourself if you'd like to.
Oh. Okay. When individuals act righteously and are outstanding in the service of their Creator, they generate tremendous merit for the souls of their parents. This merit is simply by virtue of their parents having served as the instruments of their birth. It is the parents who enabled their soul to be born into this world, which in turn enabled the many righteous deeds that they perform. The parents, therefore, have a share in their meritorious acts. However, anyone's charity or prayers on behalf of a departed person are beneficial for the soul of the deceased. It is therefore a Jewish custom to give charity and do other good deeds on behalf of the deceased in order to cause satisfaction to the soul.
Thank you. So we have a differentiation here between the children of the deceased and other people. The children of the deceased, by their very existence, they are essentially connected. It is in their parents' honor that they are in this world. And so any act they do, even if it isn't consciously in honor or in merit of their parents' elevation, it's an act that contributes to their parents moving up on another level. So when we do any mitzvah on a random Tuesday without thinking about our parents, we go ahead and we put on tefillin. We go ahead and we light Shabbos candles. We eat kosher. We study some extra Torah. By very definition of us being a child, we are now contributing to our parents' ascent. Other people, siblings, parents for children, friends, family, other people, community members, it needs to be a conscious, a meditated action. I am doing this in honor of so-and-so. When we do that, we are contributing to their credits. We are now having that intervention mechanism for their soul. which is why the first 12 months are crucial. During the first 12 months following the passing of a loved one, following the passing of a friend, close family, whatever, whoever it may be, they are crucial because it's that time when the soul needs the most credits possible it can rack up. It needs the most elevation, soul oil, if you will, soul gas possible to lift it up. You know, they say the story of a terrible person who never did a single good deed was sent straight to Gehenna. One day, he's abruptly summoned to the front desk and he's sent to heaven. He's thinking he's out of place. He has no idea why he's sent to heaven, but he's there. Suddenly, after 3 days, as abruptly and as suddenly he was sent to heaven, he's sent right back to hell. Confused, in wonder, he walks to the secretary and says, "What's going on here? I'm a terrible person. I've never did a single good deed. I was sent to heaven, right back to purgatory. What's going on?" And the secretary says, "It's very simple. 3 days ago, your son wrote $1 million check to charity in your merit. And that's it. Automatically, you were sent to heaven." He says, "So what happened?" He says, "Aha, 3 days today, the check bounced." So when it comes, it's up to us specifically these 12 days, these 12 months following the passing of a loved one. That's the time when we have to step up our game. And then again, on every yard site. On every yard site is an auspicious time. It's that time when the soul is making that quantum leap. We want that soul to have the best leap possible. Let's do on the day of the yard site, let's do a tremendous mitzvah. And if you look on page 147, you'll see these are suggested mitzvot that can benefit the souls of the departed, specifically during the 12 months, but at any time, throughout any year, however many years later it may be, to do it in their honor. As well as the times that we say Yizkar. Which is why during the Yizkar prayer, on the days that we say Yizkar, Yom Kippur, the end of Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret, Passover, Shavuot, when we say Yizkar, those are times when the souls are going through that leaping process, that elevation process. It's up to us, their loved ones, or family members, or friends, to think about what mitzvah can I take upon myself? Maybe I'll study a little extra Torah in their merit, to take upon in the merit of a loved one. Or I'll give some extra charity, I'll sponsor a Torah class, or I'll start putting on tefillin more often, or I'll eat a little extra kosher. Step up my game in order to give extra spiritual gas, which is why on the yard site, we also have such customs. Page 148, many different customs. We light a candle, that's as we discussed last week. We study Torah. Specifically, we study the Mishnah because Mishnah has the same letters as the Hebrew word neshama, soul. And by study of Torah and the merit of our loved ones, we then cause their soul to be elevated to greater heights. We get called to the Torah. We visit their grave and say words of prayer. That is all us giving more gas, adding credit to their accounts to enable them to reach greater heights. Which brings us to the topic with which we will conclude tonight's class, and that is the saying of the Kaddish. Why do we say Kaddish? It's probably the most well-known Jewish morning custom throughout history. What is the Kaddish? The text of Kaddish is a proclamation of God's greatness and holiness. And it's recited recurring during the 11 months, multiple times during the day, and on the annual yard site. Text 13, page 149, is the text of the classic Kaddish. Exalted and hallowed be his great name, and the congregation answers, Amen, throughout the world which he has created according to his will. May he establish his kingship, bring forth his redemption, and hasten the coming of his Mashiach. Amen. In your lifetime and in your days, and in the lifetime of the entire house of Israel, speedily and soon, and say, Amen. May his great name be blessed forever and to all eternity. Blessed and praised, glorified, exalted and extolled, honored, adored, and lauded be the name of the Holy One. Blessed be he. Amen. Beyond all the blessings, hymns, praises, and consolations that are uttered in the world, and say Amen. May there be abundant peace from heaven and a good life for us and for all Israel, and say Amen. He who makes peace in his heavens may make peace for us and for all Israel, and say Amen. Why? Why is this, reading the English translation, understanding what it means, why is this so potent? Why is it the ultimate way, the ultimate idea of honoring those who have passed? What's the significance of the Kaddish? And we're going to read text 14, which is interestingly enough, I guess by divine providence, it's written by Rabbi Adin Even Yisrael Steinsaltz, a great Torah sage who Time magazine has called a once-in-a-millennium scholar, who's actually, during the 12 months now of his passing, he sadly passed throughout about 6 months ago. So his children are currently saying Kaddish for him. May this be a merit for his soul. Text 14. Rachel, would you like to, I don't know if you read, actually, I think you read already today. Did you?
Yes.
Okay, so Shmuel, Bob, would you like to read for us? Text 14, page 151.
Every member of the community of Israel is, in a sense, among those who establish and proclaim God's sovereignty in the world. As the verse states, you, Israel, are my witnesses, God declares. Therefore, the absence of any individual creates a void, as it were, in God's sovereignty in the world. In order to fill this void, others need to intensify their work and to proclaim on their own behalf, as well as on behalf of the deceased, exalted and hallowed be his great name. With this perspective, we can understand why reciting the Kaddish elevates the soul of the deceased. The aggregate of a person's actions and accomplishments in this world define his or her life. However, the tally of the person's achievements does not necessarily conclude at the moment of death. A complete evaluation of a person's accomplishments must also include all that is accomplished as a result of the person's inspiration and actions. Therefore, when those who remain alive, and especially the person's children and descendants, whose very existence is a credit to their forebears, do good deeds, they contribute to the deceased's balance of accomplishments. For although the deceased is no longer active in this world, his or her actions continue to inspire positive deeds and actions. That is why the recitation of the Kaddish elevates the soul, because God is being exalted in this world as a result and in the name of the deceased.
Thank you. It must be noted, though, that however important the Kaddish is, taking upon ourselves a physical mitzvah, a resolution to do something tangible, like putting on tefillin, lighting Shabbos candles, giving extra charity, and doing all these commandments regularly in the merit of a loved one, is even more important than the recitation of Kaddish. Because Kaddish is singing praise to the Almighty. And guess what? The soul can do that as well. It may be on a different level, maybe on a different plane. It's not in the physical world, but it can do that as well. And it actually does. It sings praise of the Almighty. But the soul cannot do the physical mitzvahs, and that's up to us to do. But let's not get carried away. We discussed here all the spiritual ideas of the afterlife. Gehenna, the soul catharsis, paradise, that experiencing the deep relationship with the Almighty. But that's not the ultimate. That's not where it's at, like we explained in lesson 1 and 2. Imagine for a moment a medical researcher who, after years of research and trial and error, has discovered the ultimate cure for all cancers. Amazing work. It's sent out far and wide, faster than the COVID vaccine has been sent out. Yeah. And in no time, the entire population, anyone who may or has cancer is given this cure that this medical researcher came up with and is cured. The Nobel Prize committee gathers together and they decide that without question, it goes to this researcher, the Nobel Prize this year in medical sciences. It goes to this researcher and they call him up and they invite him and he comes and they give him this great reward. And he comes up to give his speech. That moment of him receiving the Nobel Prize is anticlimactic. Because yes, it's a great reward and it's a recognition of all the good that he's done, and there's something so tremendous. But you know what is even greater for him? Not that moment. The greatest moment for him is every time someone uses that medication and gets healed. That's what's great for him. The Nobel Prize, all right, it's good to be recognized. It's good to get a little prize on the side, but that's not the prize for this medical researcher. As a matter of fact, in many cases, he maybe couldn't even care less for that, because it pales in comparison to that reward of him experiencing the healing of the entire world from something so terrible. That's exactly this idea. This experience of relationship, this deep relationship with the Almighty that the soul is now able to experience, it's receiving the Nobel Prize for our action in this world. Our action in this world, our performance of commandments in this world, our living through this world and overcoming those challenges to perform the mitzvahs is building that relationship, is creating and experiencing, is creating that relationship with the Almighty. That's where it's at. Experiencing that relationship is enjoyable, it's pleasurable for the soul, but it isn't the ultimate. Text 15, page 153. The primary reward in the hereafter is the soul returning to its source and uniting with God. Certainly, however, it is even greater when the soul connects with God here in this world through the study of the Torah and performance of mitzvot. For that is the purpose of creation. And so living life here in order to receive the world in the next world, and to receive reward in the next world, is moving our center of attention from where it should be. Our attention should not be on heaven, on hell, on what's going to happen, on the great reward we will come. Our attention should be focused on this deep relationship we are currently building with the Almighty through the fulfillment of the mitzvahs, which explains, and we'll conclude with this, the powerful statement of Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi, text 16 on page 154. When our master and teacher, Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi, would enter a state of spiritual ecstasy, he would be heard exclaiming, "I want nothing at all. I don't want your paradise. I don't want your world to come. I want nothing but you alone. I want just the Almighty." How do we get the Almighty? We get the Almighty. We create that deep relationship with the Almighty by performance of the mitzvot. What happens in the afterlife is secondary. And so we might not see it with our physical eyes. We might not be able to feel or feel that we're experiencing it at this moment, but we are. The deepest intimacy with God is experienced right here, right now, throughout our everyday lives, one mitzvah at a time. We'll conclude with just an overview of what we discussed, and then we'll get to the questions.
Lesson 4. Where we go. 1. God's rewards and punishments are natural consequences of our actions. 2. When we do mitzvot, we forge an intimate relationship with God. In the afterlife, our souls experience the effects of our actions, our relationship with God. This is the greatest possible pleasure, and is also known as paradise, Gan Eden. 3. At times, a soul cannot enter paradise immediately, for its inappropriate actions in this world diminished its capacity to experience spiritual pleasures. Gehinnom, a painful yet cleansing process, is temporary. Every soul ultimately reaches paradise. 4. In Gan Eden, the soul constantly ascends to higher levels. Good deeds performed in a person's memory, including the recital of Kaddish, elevate the soul to higher levels that it cannot attain on its own. 5. What we do here and now is more important than the pleasures or pain of the afterlife. Living in order to receive rewards in the next world, or to avoid heavenly punishment, distracts our focus from where it belongs, increasing goodness and godliness in this world.
And so take a moment and think about what's one good deed we can take upon ourselves to do in memory of a loved one who has recently passed or has passed long ago, a friend, family member, a parent, something we haven't done until now, and we're going to step up our game and give it our all because we want the best for our loved one. Next week, we're going to discuss reincarnation, what Judaism says about it, what forms it takes on, and what we can do about it. Looking forward to that. We'll go through some of the questions now.